Okay, well, welcome everyone. I'm excited to have you here. First, I want to introduce myself and then let Rick introduce himself. Most of you I've probably already communicated with. I'm Bob. My boat is Pandora. And my wife and I'm president of Salty Dawg and have been involved in the board for over 6 years, I guess, and started following Salty Dawg even before that. Back in 2012, I retired and we started spending the winters afloat and covered most of the areas from Eastern Maine down to Key West through the Bahamas, much of Cuba, and most of the islands from Grenada up to, St. John. And we love the Eastern Caribbean. And I also bring a little different perspective than Rick does to this because I have a wife. We've been sailing together since the 70s. We met in high school, actually, and she is not a blue water kind of girl. You know, she really just gets it. Unfortunately, she just gets seasick, and nothing we've been able to do over the years has been able to address that. So she flies to meet me and then spends the season wherever we are. And that means, you know, sailing certainly many hundreds of miles in the Caribbean, island to island and so forth. But I mention this because I think that to me, the most important thing about making a passage like this is to have a good outcome the first time. Now, it's not to say that the weather won't be crappy and that you won't maybe seasick or whatever, but if you think, if there's someone that has hesitation or whatever, you know, maybe it's better to just go easy because it's not about making the trip once, it's about making the trip 10 times or as many times as you want. And you don't want to build into the equation a disconnect between what you want to do and what your partner wants to do. Ideally, yeah, it's great. I would love it if Brenda would do the passage with me. She's done it a couple of times and she just don't like it. So I figure that to keep the Admiral happy means that I use crew, which I would use anyway, but now I use at least one extra crew. So I have sailed back and forth to the Caribbean a bunch of times and have been sailing various boats up until the one we have now, which is an Aerodyne 47, a semi-custom 47-foot high performance sloop. So with Rick is also a long-time participant in Salty Dawg. He was on the board long before I was, took a break and when recently rejoined the board and is there currently as our treasurer. Rick has tremendous amount of experience, and I'm going to let him talk a little bit about that in a moment or now.
Okay, whenever you want. So Julie, my wife, and I started long distance sailing back in 1990. We did the first Caribbean 1500 and then went around the world in Jimmy Cornell's first round the world rally. We've done 12 trips back and forth to the Caribbean and a couple of Atlantic crossings and a couple of Bermudas. And we've been out at sea a long time and really enjoyed it. And we've sailed a variety of boats offshore from a Diana 37 to an Outremer 51, which was the last big sailboat that we had. And fortunately, I guess we've gone to the dark side. I've got a 33-foot power boat now, but I still remember how to sail. And we're happy to talk about this. I've spent a long time with the Caribbean 1500 teaching about offshore sailing. We did three seminars a year, and starting with Steve Black in 2000. And I just really dropped out of doing that a couple of years ago. So I've got a lot of experience talking with people like you who are beginning your offshore sailing career. And I think that take a very pragmatic attitude towards this. We're going to talk about some things that I do, and frankly, I hope you won't do them the way I do them. I hope that you will be encouraged to develop a system that works on your boat, because none of our boats, the Diana 37, the Diana 52 that we had, the Saga 48 that we had, and the Outremer 51. None of them sailed the same way. We had to develop a different set of systems for each one. And I'll end this with saying that while I think I've got a lot of experience, I certainly continue to learn every time I'm offshore on somebody else's boat. So this is an ongoing thing, which is what I think makes sailing worth doing. So what I say is not manna from heaven, but it's a suggestion to you guys to pick it up and run with it in a way that fits your sailing styles, the number of crew that you have on board, the experience level of crew that you have on board. And with that, I'll stop and let Bob start to answer some questions, and we'll go along. One last thing, I'll give you my email address, which is rick@saltydogsailing.org. And please feel free anytime you want to send me an email if you've got questions. I hope that this will develop into an ongoing dialogue between a lot of us.
Thank you, Rick. And to that point, my email is bob@incredibly enough saltydogsailing.org. And one of the 2 years ago, when I couldn't do any sailing, I set up a mentoring program like this just for some people that I knew through the sailing community, because I thought it was something worth exploring, and it was kind of fun. We did it. The format we're going to use here is a little bit different. There was about a dozen couples that we met with a bunch of times. But in this particular case, our plan is to start. We're going to do 2 of these, if that works for everyone. Maybe we'll do another one next week, perhaps. And then we're going to split off and assign everyone to a mentor. It can be someone like me or Rick that can answer as often and as many questions as you have, kind of like a concierge service, because really, in reality, Salty Dawg's mission is to give people the skills to have a safe and fun offshore passage. And make no mistake about it, when you're in the middle of the ocean, rally or not, you're on your own. And it can be a bit daunting. But it's funny, I often will sit on shore looking out on a crappy day. It's especially the case on the eastern side of any of the Caribbean islands. And I look out and I go, holy crap, I would never want to sail out there. But somehow when you're out there and you're part of it, it's not that big of a deal. And it's a little bit like the difference, perhaps. I don't go from personal experience of inheriting a teenager through a previous marriage, but I have heard that being hurled into that maelstrom can be pretty horrifying. But if you raise them from babies, as the pain level goes up inch by inch, somehow it doesn't seem all that bad. And I think that sailing offshore is like that. And I have been out in the ocean when it has been flat like Long Island Sound, and you're like, I can't believe it. There is not even a swell out here. And then I've been out sailing in 20-foot waves and wishing I were not there. But the key really is to think about all the things that can go wrong, and we can easily spend an hour talking about horrible stuff. But I thought many of you were nice enough to send me some questions, and I'm not going to have a particular order, and we're going to try to be informal about this. And I thought we would handle this also like a control net, where if you have a question, just put up your hand, and I may say go ahead iPhone or whatever, or owner, but I'll try to respond to that. And Rick and I will try to give you some answers. And it's fine to interrupt. We're just going to kind of walk through these. I thought at first I would try to organize them by category. But it's just like I was busy remodeling a bathroom, and I wanted to go for a walk today, so I didn't do that. So in any event, in no particular order, Jonathan asked about PLBs. And I thought I would ask Rick, there are several questions about that and about safety and gear. And I think that's kind of a good place to start.
Yeah, certainly personal man overboard beacons have become the thing, but that doesn't really replace the regular, sorry, I lost the word here. It doesn't really replace your
EPIRB.
EPIRB, yeah, thank you. It doesn't really replace your EPIRB. First of all, it's got a much weaker signal. And secondly, the battery life on them is much shorter. Carry both? Certainly. I've been with people and been on boats where the guys The owner gave everybody a PLB before they left, and obviously they left it with a boat. But that's not a bad way to handle that. I've also only used an EPIRB, and part of it is really what trip you're going to do. The trip that you're going to do down to the Caribbean is full of boats. There are boats out there all the time, and you're not going to be wandering off the off the beaten path. There's big ship traffic. There are going to be a lot of sailboats with maybe up to 100 sailboats with our group. And then, of course, there are other boats going down. So just having an EPIRB on board so that somebody can get your position and they can coordinate getting another vessel over to you is probably the best thing.
To that point, I think the most important thing, I personally have a personal AIS on my life jacket, figuring that the hope would be that if I fall overboard and I'm not tethered, and I'm going to get back to that in a minute, that hopefully I won't be out of range. I guess if I had to do it again, I'd probably go with a PLB because the range is better. Because AIS is line of sight, and when you're that low in the water, I can't imagine it goes all that far. But more importantly is on Pandora, and this is with a full enclosure and a deep cockpit. No one is allowed out of the cabin anytime, day or night, offshore without clipping on. I have a jack line that runs the length of the cabin, the cockpit, and I have attachment points, and we're quite assiduous about that. And when it's hot, it can be kind of a pain. And no one's allowed to go on deck without a lifeline. And you've got to use the short one, not the long one, because it should have a 3 foot and a 6 foot. And never go on deck, even for 1 second, even lean out unless there's somebody else on the cockpit with you. Because my personal opinion is if you fall overboard, you're probably not going to be recovered in time. It's a very big ocean out there. And I just make an absolute assumption that either you do it right or you might get lost. And witness the loss in the recent Bermuda race. You know, they lost an experienced skipper over the side. They retrieved him, but not until after he had drowned. And I heard that the boat got pooped, which means it's not something you can really prepare for. And he wasn't clipped on apparently. Anything more on that point, Rick?
No, I think it's important to understand that you're sailing shorthanded, and in many instances at night you're going to be sailing single-handed because you'll have one person up and everybody else on the boat asleep. So the business of being hooking on before you come up the companionway stairs and staying hooked on all of the time is extremely important.
John, you had a question.
Well, my question on the PLB was some are AIS and some are like an EPIRB, a 406. And so that was my question. Which one is better? And kind of,
Rick, why don't you respond to
into
that?
the whole tether thing also, and I believe in that. And I also I was in the Navy and trying to recover someone, a PLB, something with an AIS, that's your local thing is probably going to be better for you to recover them.
Okay.
We also have an EPIRB on board. That's for kind of us and hopefully when the shit hits the fan off the boat.
Yeah.
But my question is on a life vest, is it better to have a personal AIS or better to have a personal EPIRB, I guess?
I would prefer to have an AIS so that you can come back and get me, because you're going to be maybe a mile or two away from me, and sending a signal to the Coast Guard or trying to get a signal to the Coast Guard in Newport News isn't going to do you much good. What you want to do is get the person out of the water fast.
Yeah, so then just to drop a brand name, I was looking at this Ocean Signal Rescue Me.
Yeah.
I think any brand is going to be okay because they, just buy a good one and make sure that you test it and that the batteries are up to date and so forth and so on. And if you have further questions, that's a good example of maybe, like, for example, John, if you email me, I'll send you an email of the one I have on the boat.
Okay.
let's see, to touch for a moment on watches, and I thought that I would respond to that. The way we handle things on Pandora, and I used to have 4 people on board, and for this run, I personally, well, most boats have 4, and we recommend that. I have settled on 3, in part because I have a wind vane steering, which can make, because most of the time, things are pretty benign, even when it's a little rough. If the boat's set up right, it's not all that bad. And as Rick said, in our case as well, we generally do 1-person watches unless things go bad. But it's not uncommon for us to have all 3 people on deck. Let me just give you an example. When last spring coming back, we have slab reefing on the boat, and that means that the line goes up through the leech and then comes back down and is tied on the boom. And the line for the second reef came untied. I used just a bad knot, and it came loose. And it took 2 of us to retrieve that line because it had gone through the kringle and dropped down into the water. It was really quite a process, but we talked about it. We did it very deliberately. There were 2 of us on deck and 1 at the helm, even though we left the autopilot on and we bore off to make it more comfortable. The point was that we thought it through and we really were careful. Fatalities are rare, but they do happen, and it's not unheard of. Let's see.
Come back to that for just a second for the watches. I think it's important that you set up a watch system that works for you. Julie and I have a watch system that works for us because she can go to sleep in an instant and I can't. So I often take, and if we've got 3 on board, I reserve the right not to cook, but I'm available to the crew for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If you need me, you get me up. I don't care if I just went to sleep 15 minutes ago. And for that, Julie and I have worked out that I don't cook. Now, maybe she doesn't like my cooking, but after a lot of sea miles, this works for us. And that's what I say when you guys, couples, if you've got 3 or 4 on board, figure out who does what best. Some people may like to be up in the morning. I particularly like to be up at sunrise because I do a walk around on the boat to see what's going on. And I'm wide awake by that time. I'm kind of ready to go to bed, but I'm wide awake. When somebody else comes up, I'll get out of the cockpit, go walk around, look for bits and pieces on the deck. And the other thing is that I think you need to be flexible. We've had somebody that got sick on the boat and couldn't really stand a watch. So Julie and I had to take over, and you need to be flexible. You need to be able to fit somebody in. I don't think it's worth, on our small boats and on and frankly, a 50-footer is a small boat these days. On our small boats, I don't think it's worth taking somebody off unless they really just want to cook and don't have any ability to run the boat on their own, to pull them off and just make them the cook. I think that people need to carry a bigger weight on a boat like this.
What we do on Pandora is I like what we call the dog watch, the 4 to 8, and I don't sleep well in the early evening. So what we do is I basically say, if it's okay with you guys, I'm going to do that, and then I'll let the other 2 choose. And so we have a formal watch system. There's always someone on deck all the time. But during the day, it's a little more flexible, but starting it after dinner time when things are cleaned up, we always try to have dinner done before it gets dark. And then from 8 to midnight, midnight to 4, 4 to 8. And I am available all that time. And one of the rules that I use is we use AIS. We're very assiduous about keeping track with tracking and closest point of approach. And if anybody is showing a CPA of 2 miles or less, I want to know about it. And I will call once that person is close enough. And with Class A, which is what the big boats have, the range is about 15 miles. And with Class B that we have, it's about half that. So it is not uncommon. I won't usually call someone until they're 20 minutes out or so because they won't see me anyway. And then I'll say, what would you like me to do? And I try to give them an example of what's happening, you know, CPA, port to port, whatever. And almost always they just say, no, keep going. I will alter course 5 degrees starboard or whatever. And the sooner you're able to communicate with them, the less dramatic the turn they have to take is. And when you're talking about a carrier that's 1,000 feet long, you prefer to have them not have to do something too exciting and to avoid you. And the sooner you can reach to them, probably the better the chances are that that there'll be they'll say, you know, just keep doing what you're doing and I'll get out of your way. Average temperatures in Norfolk, Bermuda, and Bermuda, Antigua, or Newport, or Norfolk, yes. As a rule, it's pretty chilly leaving from Hampton. It gets quite cold until we cross the Gulf Stream. And so that means that for the first day or two, it's pretty chilly. But after that, it gets hot. And the further south you get, it gets really warm. And we never open up anything because you just can't be, I can't tell you how many times I've cracked a hatch and walked up on deck and suddenly a wave comes slapping over the side of the boat and there's a bunch of water on the counter. And that's, you know, it's our home. And the idea of trying to deal with a bunch of salt on a cushion is just a total non-starter for me. So you figure that that the temperatures are not frost-like, but out on the water, it can be pretty chilly. But once you get into the Gulf Stream, it's quite warm. And you're talking mid-80s all the way and probably a little warmer down below.
Plenty of fans on board's a big help.
It does help. Yeah, we installed several fans so that no matter what, there's always a fan over you. And in our case, because we use 3, someone takes the aft cabin. I take the starboard starboard berth with a lee cloth, and then someone else goes to port. And the reason starboard for me is it's just easier for me to get up and check instruments and so forth and so on from there. One of the questions that I get a lot, and this is all kind of random, so forgive me because I'm not as organized maybe as I should be, but I get a lot of emails saying, well, I'm going to be leaving my boat in Antigua to go home for the holidays, or I want to take a break, or I want to have crew come to visit or something. The flying in and out of Antigua is pretty easy. The flights right now are cheapest out of New York. They happen to be considerably more expensive out of Miami for some reason. But the good news is they're a lot cheaper than from Europe. I was on the phone today with someone in Antigua, and I was surprised to hear there was such a difference between New York and Miami. I don't know why that is right now, but it is. So there's a couple of options for leaving boats, and you flying out of the airport. It's about a 30-minute, $40 cab ride to the airport. There's always taxis around. I actually have a taxi driver that I like to use, and if anyone wants his name is Eric. He's just a terrific guy, very reliable. And they all charge the same. It's set by the government anyway, and Eric's a good guy. We try to support him. In terms of leaving the boat, Jolly Harbor has a very nice marina, and there is that you get I think a 15% discount. The dockage in Antigua and throughout the Caribbean is pretty inexpensive, more like $1 a foot, maybe about $1.50 for a multi-hull. But electricity is 75 to 85 cents per kilowatt hour, so it can really add up. Not uncommon for it to be as much as the dockage. But they have regular flights, and I personally, because we have pretty good solar power on the boat, to run our fridge, whether we're plugged in or not, I take a mooring, and that's about $20 to $25 a day. And then you can hire someone to keep an eye on your boat. And again, if anyone wants individual names, just email me and I will be happy to respond to that. Another topic that I'm particularly interested in, I'm going to take this and then I'm going to let Rick talk for a few minutes, is water makers. My wife and myself, we both like to be clean. We shower every day and we have a water maker. You can get water in the Caribbean. You pay for it by the gallon, might be 25 cents, 20 cents, something like that. Water is good quality, but it can be a pain to get it, to be honest with you. Almost all the boats have a water maker on them. If you want a water maker, there's two kinds to think about. One is a 110 run, and there's pretty inexpensive water makers that you can run right off of a little Honda generator that'll make 20 gallons an hour, and they're not that expensive. I have a Spectre unit because it's so efficient, and about 3 times the price, I think, of what I just described a moment ago. But I have it because it's so efficient. I can run it right off my solar panels. And we generally go through about 15 gallons of water a day. And some people think that's horrifyingly large, but I think it's pretty reasonable. We don't wash dishes with salt water. We wash them with fresh, and we rinse off. We're pretty careful about it. And I personally think that a water maker is, well, certainly for me, it's the very best investment I could make in keeping Brenda on the boat. And so I would say, sure, you can get water, but it's just one more hassle. Unless, of course, you have 200-300 gallons. We only carry 100, and that doesn't last but a week. So, and the question was, can you catch rainwater? Yes, but keep in mind the Caribbean, it will rain every day pretty much every day up until the spring when it gets to be a little drier. If you're in the lee of the taller mountains, because the water is condensed as it comes up and the dew point falls and you get rain, but it's not heavy rain. It doesn't last for very long. If you're on a very low island, the same like in the Bahamas, you may not get any rain for weeks at a time. So I would not rely on water catchment as a way to get water. But if you are going to go to marinas, bring collapsible jugs. And there's 2 kinds that I have used, and I use them on the boat just in case I have a problem. There's the kind that has a little red handle. Those do not hold up real well. The one I get are the ones with the molded integral handle, and they generally don't spring any leaks. So if you have 3 or 4 of those and a good engine and a dinghy, you can move them back and forth.
So Don asked whether or not there's at Jolly Harbor, there's a water taxi in from the moorings. No, there isn't.
No.
At least there was not when I was there.
I don't think there's a water taxi. It's rare. Water taxis are fairly rare in the Caribbean. Yeah, Don.
How do you get from your mooring to shore when you're leaving the boat for a period of time?
That's a good question. The way I do it is I either get a fellow cruiser, or if I'm renting a mooring, I get the person who owns the mooring to do it for me, to bring me out. And I leave the dinghy in the davits with the plug pull, because in a month you could end up with bent 500 pounds of water in your dinghy.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. All right. And if I could, just one other question.
Sure.
Because you touched on it. On your water maker, do you carry a spare membrane, or are those available down there? You don't worry about it?
You can get most anything you want in the Caribbean. It may take a little bit of time. And certainly you can go into a chandlery in St. Martin, and you can walk out with anything you could possibly want. And right in Falmouth, there's a water maker, a guy, he'll get you anything you want. You'll pay more for it. What I do carry is I carry spare pressure pumps. Mm-hmm. And I also carry loads of filters.
Right. Yeah.
And I have an automatic system, which caused me all kinds of trouble. So I worked with Spectra to put it up to make it completely manual.
Yeah, I have a full manual system.
Yeah, that works really well.
Okay.
They're pretty bulletproof, I've found.
Okay, great.
One of the questions that comes up often is sail inventory. And one of the most common things I run into is people who are used to cruising coastal, especially Long Island Sound and the Chesapeake. They have big sails. And I'm going to let Rick respond to that whole issue because it's really different offshore.
It's very different offshore, and we made it a practice to change down when we just had one roll of furling headsail and a hank-on staysail. We made it a practice to take the big jib off and put the 110 or 120 up before we left Norfolk, because believe it or not, that 120 will actually drive the boat pretty well. You're going to be sailing, hopefully, with a reasonable level of wind most of the time. And if you can't get the boat going with a 110 and a full, or 120 and a full main, it's probably time to turn on the engine anyway, and motor some of the trip. Could everybody mute their microphones if we don't have it muted? Because I'm getting a constant feedback. That's better. That's much better. Sail inventory. I would certainly have, if all you have is a 140 and a main, you're going to end up rolling up that 140 a fair amount on the way down, because the wind can get pretty sporty. 20 knots, 25 knots is common. That's what you're going to be sailing, and that's what you should be prepared to sail in. 40, 45 knots is not common. But if you have what you have and you have to figure out how to deal with it, then make sure that your roller furling is in good shape. Make sure that it's serviced. Make sure that the clevis pins are in right. Make sure the cotter pins are in right. And on your mainsail, 3 reefs would be ideal. And most mainsails, you can put a 3rd reef in. You may have to run another line on it, but it's worth doing, because getting the main under control, particularly when you're running downwind in heavy wind, is very important. Frankly, what we do is that if the wind's over 25 knots and behind us, we get rid of the main entirely. On a boat like we're sailing, the thing that does the most damage to people is a boom flying around when you're trying to reef or when you do an accidental jibe. So we get rid of the main and frankly just sail under the jib. The boat does, if you've got a reasonably fast boat, you'll do 7.5 knots or 8 knots, and quite safe, and the boat steers better. You take the pressure off the autopilot, you take the pressure off the wind vane, and you take a lot of pressure off the crew.
And to that point, we generally sail with a very conservative sail plan. My boat has a Solent rig, so it has a large light sail, code 0, rolled up on a forward stay, and then it has a 100 and a large main with a big roach with 3 reefs. And it doesn't take a lot of wind to push our boat, but we almost never, in fact, I probably should just pull the code 0 down and stow it, because it just sits up there, and most of the time it gets used is when I pull it off to put a new sun cover on. But to Rick's point, and even in January, you probably hang out in Antigua because the wind's going to be blowing 20, 25, or 25 to 30, and it's just not that much fun to why go there, hang out locally. So we generally sail with a reef in our main. And we have a pretty powerful boat that doesn't heel very much, but like, why push it? It doesn't change, but maybe a half a knot, or maybe a knot at the most. And so count on having a lot of wind all the time. And keep in mind that the waves, the distances between islands are short. The longest run we make in the course of a season, unless we're skipping an island, is 70 miles, and more often than not, 25 to 50. So but you're also going to be in a, you're going to be sailing on a reach, a close reach most of the time, or a beam reach. And the reason it's a close reach is because you're moving fast and the wind's right on the beam, and so now it's close. But the waves are big, but the period is long, 12 seconds or so. And that's a pretty easy. They're coming right at the side of the boat, and occasionally they'll slap over you, but more often than not, they won't. Let's see. Don,
iPhone.
Yeah, excuse me.
Yeah, we had a quick question about, I mean, you're talking about going to Antigua. We're going to the Bahamas now. Is the weather situation similar?
Okay, the weather, I'm sorry, I was focusing on Antigua. My apologies. I'd forgotten that we had Bahamas bound boats here too. The weather, the wind in the Bahamas, especially early in the season, Benjamin, you're getting a lot of background noise. The early in the season, it can be really windy in the Bahamas. And
Bob, you can mute Ben too,
I got him. So early in the season, especially, you're going to see fronts that are going to come through, and it can be quite windy, but usually most of the time the wind is out of the east and you're in the lee of the land. But about once a week or maybe every 4 days, the wind's going to clock, and you may be forced to run for cover. But it is almost always pretty windy. That's good though, because it's hot, and it's always hot. Everywhere we go, it's hot. And the thing that's really challenging in New England during the summer is the wind dies at night. But in the Caribbean and the Bahamas, it gets a little stronger at night. So there's usually a good breeze. One thing in particular, though, is just an anecdote, is in the Bahamas, there's a lot of currents where you're going to be anchoring, because generally the deeper places have currents in them. And so the boat may not be sitting directly headed into the wind. So sometimes when the tide is changing, it gets kind of hot down below until it settles into the new direction. It's not uncommon for your boat to be beamed to the wind as the current pushes it sideways. But there's always wind, except right before the front.
One of the questions was, should we bring a spinnaker? And
I wouldn't.
we carried a spinnaker all the time. When we sailed around the world, we carried a spinnaker and we used it a lot. But you're probably not going to use it a great deal in the Caribbean. You might use it a fair amount coming back up the island chain, but certainly going to Antigua, it's unlikely that you'll be sailing with a spinnaker. And as Bob has said a couple of times in this, take it easy. You don't need to push the boat hard. There's no trophy at the end of this. There's no check at the end of this for being first. And the islands have been there for a while. They'll be there when you get there. If you get there a day later, it's not going to make much difference.
That is true.
If you have a spinnaker and if you want to carry it with you, there's no reason not to, if you've got room to carry it. If you're going to give up something else like spare parts to put the spinnaker on board, I'd probably leave the spinnaker home.
Yeah, to that point, I think it'd be almost safe to say the only time you'll use a spinnaker would be either coming home or maybe under unusual circumstances going south. More often than not, going south, you're kind of challenged because the wind is close reaching most of the time, or beam reaching, except when there's a front coming through. And when you're in the Caribbean, you're always sailing on a beam. I've never had a downwind sail until I get pretty far north. And to that point, the trip south is a little more challenging than the trip north, whether you're going to the Bahamas or the Caribbean. The time in the fall, it's November, the summer winds and the winter winds are duking it out. And so you have a lot of fronts and so forth. In the spring, it's a lot more benign. It took me 12 days to get to Antigua last fall, and I burned a lot of fuel. I ran the engine for over 150 hours because I don't like to sit. When I'm going under 6 knots, I just turn on the engine. But On the way home, I made the whole trip to Virginia in just a little more than 7 days. And the first day we did 195 miles, the second day 180 something, and the wind was amazing. It was fabulous. I didn't even turn the engine on until we got near the Gulf Stream.
So Bob was talking about if people ask the average trip when they're thinking about sail inventory. And as Bob said, we've had some of them, where we've done 7 days and 2 hours to the British Virgin Islands. And we've had them where we've motored 156 hours to the British Virgin Islands. I think if I were preparing a boat, I would prepare the boat to motor at least 25% of the trip.
Yeah, and it really, I mean, the wind will always pick up eventually, but the people said to me, it was interesting, we have comment, well, Salty Dawg, they always motor, they don't just sit. And I personally don't like to motor. I mean, I don't like to sit. I would just as soon keep moving. But with the fastest run I've seen from anyone was somebody who hard on the wind did a single handed in a 70-foot carbon boat, did it in 7 days. But more often than not, it's anywhere between 10 to 14, sometimes even longer. If it's a small boat under 40 feet, it could take more than 2 weeks. But the biggest limitation often is fuel. And while Rick, we recommend a minimum of 25%, I would run out of fuel if that was the case. And I carry enough fuel. I actually have a bladder, a 50-gallon bladder that I keep in a vented locker. That's a big bladder. It's huge. It's almost 6 feet long. And I can transfer the fuel into one of my tanks. So I can motor almost the whole way. Because I feel like no matter what fuel costs, it's dirt cheap when you're stuck in the middle of the ocean and you got nowhere to go with no wind. So I don't want to, plus I want to get to Antigua, or I want to get to my destination. Frankly, I really enjoy cruising, but I'm not a huge fan of passage making, mostly because Brenda's not there, and as nice as the guys are, they stink, and maybe I do too. One of the questions also came up, always questions come up in this time about crossing the Gulf Stream and, weather routing and the use of predict wind. I think that I'd like Rick to talk a little bit about our relationship with Chris Parker and how that kind of works out. And one thing I would recommend is, even though Chris Parker is part of the rally, you're sort of paying for that as part of it, I would subscribe anyway, because you really want to keep an eye on what's going on. And I would do it before the rally. And every morning he does webinars like this. They're not somewhat interactive, but he talks about the weather for people that are out on the ocean. And I was so daunted by the whole issue of weather when I first started doing this. I thought, I am never going to figure this out. But once you've watched 50 of his webinars and you screwed around with predict wind and other programs, it becomes sort of obvious. So sign up now for Chris. It's $300 a year. It's really, or 150 if you don't get the emails. Other than that, he sends out these great emails every day, and I find them very, very useful. So Chris, Rick, you want to talk a little bit about how that works with Chris?
A couple of things. Chris Parker is an extremely good forecaster. He's done a great job for us, and we use him not only there. I use him this year coming up to Maine from our house in Virginia. He'll give us a weather forecast a couple of days before we leave, and then he'll update it every day. If I were you guys, I would start watching the weather about a week and a half before we leave. The concept of the rally is to get everybody across, and this, we have to consider the boats that are smaller and slower, get everybody across the Gulf Stream after a frontal passage, and not have anybody hung up in the Gulf Stream during a frontal passage. So that's the important thing, and that's really what you want to watch. And that's one of the reasons that we don't have an official start to this. People can go when they think it's right, when Chris tells them that they think it's right. I use every single piece of weather information I can get my hands on. I'm also a pilot, so kind of weather oriented. I do use predict wind. I use windy probably more than predict wind because I just like it better. But predict wind is a sponsor of ours, and they provide the tracking. So I think I certainly would use them. They're quite good. Somebody asked about the granularity of predict wind or windy grid files that come down. And one of the things that I would like to share with you is that for some of you, for the first time in your life, you're going to be away from instant weather, where, if I look at my iPhone, it'll tell me it's going to rain here in 18 minutes. In the middle of the ocean, that's not going to be that way. Your forecast, Chris may give you a forecast that says it's going to blow 15 knots from the northeast, and you find yourself in an area where it's blowing 35 from the northeast. These things happen out there. It's not like running up and down the East Coast where the weather on one side of 95 is one way, and you know that the weather's going to move over. You get storms that form, you get low pressure systems that form, and it makes a big difference. I wouldn't try to get too drilled down into the weather forecasts and get very small areas. I would try to get a forecast of a major area, because whatever you're going to see out there is going to come from the west. It's either going to form around you or it's going to come from the west. So if you've got a pretty good idea of what's coming up behind you, you can prepare for it. You can get yourself set for it. To look at the weather in a 12 or 15 mile box or a 20-mile box around you is really meaningless in the middle of the ocean on a small boat that's traveling at 8 knots. So take a look at the overall picture and get a good handle on that, and watch fronts that are coming. I would also watch for little oddities that come up in the grid files. All of a sudden, you'll see that you've got a little area where you've got the wind rotating in the other direction. And keep an eye on stuff like that. Talk to Chris about it, or send him an email about it and say, I see this. What do you think of it? And he'll come back to you with an answer on it. He will route the fleet in groups, because you've got boats that travel at about the same speed. Bob's boat's a little bit faster than a lot of them. You'll get a pretty good sized group that's in the 7 knot average, running down, and he'll group you together, and then he'll give you a weather forecast between a certain latitude and longitude, so that you know what's there today, and then he'll give you one that will tell you what should be there tomorrow and the next day. He doesn't get out more than about 3 days, but for what we're doing offshore, that seems to work real well. He is also very conservative and very much aware that we have people who are doing this for the first time, and he spends a lot of time trying to route people around problems. If something's coming across in front of you, he'll tell you to stop or slow down and wait until it goes by. And that's another point, by the way, about slowing down. There's nothing wrong with heaving to and letting the Gulf Stream settle down if you're late getting there, or if you're coming back and the Gulf Stream is active because there's a front going through. Heave to and wait for a day, and just enjoy being out on the ocean. And when the front's gone through, get back and sail again and move across the Gulf Stream. There's no reason for you to put yourself in danger or to push your boat that hard. Anything else I can answer kind of in this general discussion about weather?
I'm going to add to that as you consider your questions. If you're when coastal cruising, especially if you're still working and you have to be back on Sunday evening, if the wind it means you got to beat, then you beat. But in the ocean, you don't do that. If you're pointing directly to the Bahamas or to Antigua, which is almost never, that's great. But it was one year, I think it was 3 years ago, when I sailed east for 3 days, waiting for the wind to pick up and to turn from the south to the east. It was very frustrating, but it was perfectly comfortable. It was just to see the mileage to Antigua not change by 1 mile for the whole day was frustrating. But by the way, we finally got east enough, and then we had a great run out for the last 500 miles. But the point is, if it's crappy, just bear off. And even though if you may be 40 degrees off, it doesn't really matter, because you've still got 1,000 miles to go. And I, for one, would rather sail for an extra couple of days than get beat up. And when you get beat up, things break, people get hurt, and it's exhausting. And you want to be very mindful of what Chris is telling you. And one thing I would observe, and I've been working with Chris for over 10 years, is that he make it sound like this is what's going to happen 3 days out, 4 days out. And usually beyond that, he might say, well, it's a long way out, we're not sure. But even if he says this is what's going to happen 3 days from now, tomorrow he might very well say, never mind, it's different. But he won't say it's different. He's just going to say, this is what's going to happen. So it's like this rolling truth. And the only time it's completely true is when you're doing it at that moment. But he is good. And another point about forecasting is, on land, there's the radar everywhere. They can forecast quickly because weather is being collected in every neighborhood. Out at sea, it might be hundreds of miles, or 100 miles or 60 miles between collection points, or from observations from ships and so forth. So there's a lot of variation, and just a small impulse of energy going 20 degrees to one side of you versus the other way can change the direction of the wind quite dramatically. But again, just bear off, and 20 knots on the beam, 30 knots on the beam isn't horrible. 30 knots on a close haul is awful.
So we had one other question about the Gulf Stream. And then we've got a couple of questions that have come up in the chat. And I see we've got little hands up, and we're getting, time-wise, we're getting out to the end of this. I would, if I were crossing the Gulf Stream, and you see eddies on the other side of the Gulf Stream, it's very hard to hit that eddy in exactly the right place. My advice to people when they sail across the Gulf Stream and come out on the other side is, if the eddy happens to be in the right place and you can make it to it, go to it. But if it's going to take you out of the way and you think you're going to pick up 1.5 knots, those eddies move. They don't stay still. They're slow moving, but they don't stay still. I probably wouldn't try to get into an eddy. If you do notice all of a sudden that your speed over the ground has dropped by about 2.5 knots, you're in the wrong side of the eddy, and you got to figure out where you are and where that eddy is to you. And you should get a Gulf Stream forecast that Chris will do the day before we leave. So you'll have a pretty good idea of what's out there ahead of you, and it won't change that much in the 2 days that it'll take you to get across the Gulf Stream. But what most people do is head down the beach, down Virginia Beach, go across near Hatteras, and just keep going straight across the Gulf Stream. It's reasonably narrow there. It is not particularly fast flowing there, and it's a pretty good place to get across. It's about 75, maybe 80 miles across. So you get across in the second, probably by the second day that you're out, you should be through it. And then you don't have to worry about that anymore until you come home.
I mean, Chris will give us entry points and exit points along the way. And he's pretty good at some of the eddies down there are just huge. And so it's easy for him to route us. Some boats will be leaving from Newport, and that's a whole lot more complicated, and I think goes on beyond the scope of this. I suspect anyone in this group, I would not recommend you leave from Newport, because it's a whole lot more complicated, weather-wise and so forth. One of the questions is, when should we arrive in Hampton? I would recommend arriving on Thursday, the 27th. That's pretty much when registration and so forth will begin.
So
let's see. If flying into Hampton, Well, what's a good day? Okay, got it. Jolly Harbor have a taxi from your mooring. You can get a taxi anywhere in Antigua. They're stacked up along the side of the road very easily. And so that's not a problem at all. Let's see, Rick, what other questions have I missed?
So we got, I want to cover anchoring, and somebody's asked a question about spares, which I think are important because getting stuff right now is hard. And if you're going to order spares, it might take 6 or 8 weeks to get parts in. So what would I carry as spares? I certainly would carry engine belts, a couple of sets of them. I would certainly carry a ton of fuel filters, 10, 12, 15 fuel filters, particularly the Raycor filters. If you're using a 10 micron or a 2 micron Raycor filter, not much gets through there, and that's usually what's going to catch the bio problem in fuel if you run into that. And you may find that you have to change fuel filters. I would have a couple of oil filters with you. I probably would take enough oil to do 2 oil changes. I don't know how big your engines are, but you know, most of the boats that we sail, it's a couple of gallons. So I would have some oil on board, oil, fuel filters, cotter pins, some clevis pins that are pretty much the general size that you have on board. I carried a length of Dyneema that was long enough to replace the longest shroud on the boat, so that I could go up and put that on if I lost the shroud. And people lose shrouds offshore. People lose forestays offshore. And Dyneema is easy to deal with. You can wrap it up. It's stronger than stainless steel wire. It makes a very good way to handle, you know, something like that.
I carry, go ahead, Rick, sorry.
Probably would have some material to make another sheet. If you have a sheet chafed through. And I would carry a fair amount of the smaller lines that you have on board. Things like the pole, uphaul and downhaul for your whisker pole or your spinnaker pole. I carried a lot of stuff on board as spares. I did not carry injectors. I did not carry a high pressure fuel pump for the engine because unless your engine is computer controlled and relatively new, setting that and getting that installed is more than you want to take on offshore. It's very hard to work on an engine offshore. I went through and replaced all of the hoses on the engine as the boat aged. So I was pretty sure that stuff was in good shape. And coolant for the engine, I'd probably carry a gallon of coolant for the engine. You certainly don't want to put salt water in there if you don't have to. As Bob said, if you have a water maker on board, spare filters, if you have belts on it, anything that's got a belt on it, I would take a couple of belts with me. That's, you know, I would carry tools. I would carry a metric set because most of your engines are made in Japan and they're all metric. I would carry an American set of stuff, including Allen wrenches, because a lot of engines have got a lot of Allen cap screws on them. I carry, you know, a variety of screws and I bought a tackle box and filled up the little compartments in a tackle box with screws and nuts and bolts, quarter 20 bolts, 5/16 bolts, even some 3/8 inch bolts. Very good to have with you. That's pretty much what what we carried on board. When we went around the world, we had an awful lot more on board. But if this is going to be a trip to the Caribbean, when you get there, as Bob said earlier, you can get anything you want in the Caribbean. There are so many boats down there. Everybody is servicing mega yachts. And even those guys use quarter 20 bolts and nuts. You'll find it down there. It's not hard to get stuff in the Caribbean unless you're on some of the remote islands. but you can also get stuff flown in overnight. Yeah, it's expensive, but you know, it gets the job done. And this is maybe a once in a lifetime trip. So why screw it up waiting for 3 weeks for a part? Spend the $100 and get it delivered to you so you can go on and enjoy the, you know, the rest of the month.
I would echo everything Rick is saying. What I would also add to it, and he probably would recommend this as well, is bring wire connectors, because
Oh yeah,
stuff is
tons of them.
roads. I mean, my bilge pump failed in the middle of the ocean. It wouldn't shut off, and it turned out it was just a wire. I had a problem with my bow thruster, which I was without for a whole season. It turned out it was just a wire that had broken. And I bring quite a good selection of shrink tape, dielectric grease, which you can put on things to give it a little extra measure of protection. And then I have a tiny little heat gun that runs right off my inverter. It looks like a tiny hair dryer with a 1/2-inch hole in the end. And I also carry a 110 electric drill. You may find you have to fix something underway. And a battery powered one, after it sat for 6 months, the battery may very well be dead. And finally, Rick mentioned Dyneema. I carry a lot of Dyneema, not huge. I mean, I have what Rick has. I have enough to do a stay, although I've never tried to actually do that. But I have been up the mast to replace halyards and so forth. But what I also carry is thin Dyneema. And the stuff is strong as hell. It's like twine. And you can lash some, like, for example, my gooseneck, after that passage, though it worked itself so that the screw holes that hold the extrusion to the gooseneck got quite loose. So what I did is I put a Dyneema, a lashing, just in case, because I knew it would be okay unless it fell out. And it's very, very strong. So strong, in fact, that if you make it too tight and you put the boom out too far, you're probably going to bend the fitting it was on. It's stronger than anything on the boat. And it's easy to use. It holds a knot fairly well. And even though it can be so slippery, you just put a wire tie on it and it's not going to come untied. And that's another point. Wire ties, duct tape, other odds and ends are great.
Yeah.
And you can get some plumbing tape at Home Depot that you can actually stick on something when it's wet. I mean, there's lots of basic stuff. It can be very, very helpful. Now, I'm wondering.
Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah. We have not talked about anchoring. And the key point, I don't want to get into what kind of anchor is best, because I've owned them all and I have some strong opinions, but probably you guys have too. The key point is you're probably not used to anchoring in 40 feet of water, and you will. Even 50. And you're probably, if you don't have all chain, you should have at least 150 feet of chain. I carry 200 because there's a lot of crap on the bottoms. Even if you're anchoring where there's no real coral, there's probably big chunks of rocks and so forth that you might get hung up on, and nothing will chafe through your line very, very quickly. And of course, having a good solid windlass. And the good news is, if your windlass craps out, you can get a new one very easily in the Caribbean. Mine did. And so that is something to keep in mind. But assume, like, for example, in Martinique at Saint-Pierre, it is very common to anchor in 40 or more feet of water. A question that came up earlier from Alan, and he brought it up again, I hadn't addressed it yet, is a drogue. And I'd like Rick to respond to that.
If I was going to sail around the world, I might consider a drogue. If I'm just going to go to the Caribbean one time, I'm not sure I'd carry one. As a matter of fact, we never did. We've never had a drogue on board. You can certainly, if you want to slow the boat down, put the sails down, roll the jib up, put the main away, and you can take a couple of big dock lines and make a warp behind you, which will slow the boat down more than you think it will, and it'll keep the boat pointed downwind. So I've never carried a drogue, and I've never carried a para anchor either, or a sea anchor either. We've never found a need for them. One time when we were in the Western Med, we thought we were going to get into a big storm, and we were about 100 miles or 125 miles from Syria. And that didn't seem like much of a place to end up. So we ducked into Cyprus instead. But I've never, in any of the boats that I've had, and we've been in some, 50 knot winds for a couple of days. I've never had the feeling that I wanted to slow the boat down that much, that I would carry a drogue or a sea anchor. If I knew I was going to sail on lee shores a lot, I might very well put on a sea anchor. But they're very hard to deal with. They're very hard to get in. It's a great big deal. You've got to get it in. You've got to dry it out. It's quite a problem. So if you're going to do one trip to the Caribbean to find out what this is like, I think you could probably spend the money for the drogue to put some additional spares on board, or to put something else on board, to put a couple of extra fans on board to make life more comfortable for you down in the Caribbean.
I would, go ahead, Don.
Concerning the length of chain road. So we're going to the Bahamas, and I was led to believe that 100-foot of chain is plenty.
It is in the Bahamas. Yes. You'll never really, if anything, you will wish it was deeper. You're going to be anchoring in 10 feet of water often, 15 maybe, rarely 20.
Thank you. Yep, that was it.
So
go ahead, Rick.
I was going to say we've run over. It's after 6.
Yes. Are there any other questions before we break? Well, if those of you if you're interested, we'd be happy to have another one of these before we break into individual. I see some nodding. Would next week at this time work for everyone?
Monday works for me, yes.
Okay, let's do that. Let me just double check before I commit. I think that's fine for me. Yes, and then what we'll do after that is I think for this group, we'll just say email us, and I'm more than happy to take a call. I think in closing, I'll say that I do this. Probably Rick does for the same reason, because so many people helped us. And I can tell you, there is no way that I would ever have transitioned from my 20-foot catboat on Long Island Sound, where I thought 15 miles was a long way, to sailing 1,000 miles, 1,500 miles. And it's for people like you that came before me that helped. And from the very first time we headed down the Intracoastal Waterway in 2012, we met people that we are in touch with on a daily basis 10 years later. And the community, yes, we're focused on blue water sailing, that's great. But to me, it's about the destination and the community. And that is what makes it so special. And it's like a high school reunion, not just in Antigua or the Bahamas, but in every other island. As you go from place to place, you form up this little community that kind of morphs itself in and out of existence as you work through the season. So I hope that this turns out to be a great trip for you. And I would say, be prepared, but you can't be infinitely prepared. And hopefully tonight's would be useful to you. I'm sure the other questions will come up. Email us. That's bob@saltydogsailing.org and Rick at the same address. And we will look forward to next week. We'll send out an invite in the next couple of days.
Thanks very much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Take care. Have a great evening.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Thank you.